So welcome everyone. Welcome to the this Google Talk, Authors Talk. We're joined by Michael Horn. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction. Michael Horn is the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute and author of a couple of books and a bunch of publications that we're going to get into. But the first book that Michael and I met around was Disrupting the Class. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. I recommend it. It's him and Clay wrote a book about what the future of learning looks like and how technology was going to disrupt education. And this was, when was that book?
2008.
2008. So I read that book, and that's what, for me, caused me to get more interested in how technology can impact at least K-12. At that time, we were working with a lot of universities at the time. And so I want to talk a little bit about that book and the impact that book had, but I also want to get into the second book, which he wrote, called Blended. And I have this here. This is not a present for you. This is actually a present for me. I just did a keynote at the Education Elements down in San Jose, and they handed me a present, which was nice. And so I grabbed the present, put it in my back, and then I came back to the office. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what this is. And so I will open it up for you. I wonder what this present could possibly be. Oh, look, it's Blended by Michael Horn.
That was nice of them to give it to you.
And it was nice of them to give to me. And what's interesting is that if actually you open it up to the first page, and one of the reviewers is me. I reviewed the book and gave him a quote. So anyway, so I thought that was funny. So we have books in the back for sale. There's a couple up here as well that we can give away as well. But I want to get started with this idea of thinking about blended learning. You hear that terminology a lot. There's a lot of terminology get tossed around. So one, I want you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit more about your background, and then we'll get into some of the questions that I have for you.
Sure. So when we were, well, first of all, thanks for hosting me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, and thanks for all coming out. So when we were writing Disrupting Class starting in 2006, after I graduated from Harvard Business School and was one of Clay's students, and he literally snapped me up and was like, we're going to write a book on using our theories to solve the problems in education. And I was like, that sounds cool. And so I dove in and started working on it with him. And the book took 2 years to write. And about midway through, in 2007, May, actually, we decided to start up the Clayton Christensen Institute. It was originally called Innosight Institute, as a think tank, nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, where we would be able to just continue to do research around these really difficult problems facing society. We also have a healthcare practice and some other emerging research areas as a place just to continue the conversation, do research, and then really affect change itself. What Clay did not want was to write an interesting book that would gather dust on people's shelves and would not create real change. We really wanted to be out there helping make change happen. So I now run the education practice at the Clayton Christensen Institute. We have a team of just about 10 people, mix of researchers and some others, a lot of people like myself who are on the road quite a bit, talking with educators, talking with policymakers, really taking the research that we've been doing using these theories of disruptive innovation into how we can create a student-centered education system, move away from our factory model, allow every child to realize his or her fullest potential, how we can actually move forward together to make that happen. And so I think we've been in a dialogue with the education community over the last 8-9 years, really about how we move that forward.
Right, and things have progressed quite a lot since the first time you and I met at Harvard in 2007, 2008.
Somewhere, I think Disrupting Class was just coming out, I think, and it was sort of, we had this crazy prediction in the book that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be offered online in some way or fashion, most of which would be in schools. And everyone was like, well, that's kind of crazy. And it doesn't feel so crazy anymore. I mean, I think we're well on the way. Teachers are flipping their classrooms all over the country. We're seeing interesting station rotation models in lots of classrooms. We're seeing schools use online learning to connect students to teachers that don't live in the same zip code for schools that don't have access to foreign language teachers or advanced classes. And that's a really exciting thing.
Right. So let's start with some definitions.
Okay.
Right. So you have an audience here, some that get what we were talking about, some that don't know what we're talking about. So Disrupting Class led to this book, which is a little more specific, I would say. It's a little more, this is how you do it kind of thing. So what is blended learning?
Yeah, so and let me just give a little background. What happened around 2009-10 was you had a couple schools around the country that people said were doing blended learning. And they would go to education conferences that Jamie and I would often be at, and they would get up on a panel and start yelling at each other that I'm blended learning and you're not. And it was about the stupidest conversation you could possibly imagine happening. So what we did at that time was we looked at about 100 schools that people said, yeah, this feels like some blended learning is going on, talked to over 100 educators, and came up with this definition. And so I'll give you the technical one, but then I'll simplify it. The technical one has 3 parts. It's any time a student's in a formal education program in which they're learning online at least part of the time, where they have some element of control over the time, the place, the path, and or the pace of learning. So the student starts to be empowered in this experience. The second part is it's got to be at least in part in a brick and mortar location away from home with supervision, so schools, teachers. And then the third part is that the experiences that a student enjoys, they have to be connected somehow within a given subject or discipline. So what you do offline has to connect to the online experience. So in other words, when I was in school and teachers wanted to kick me out because I was just being distracting or I had already mastered something in math, and they'd say, go do Oregon Trail. Not blended learning, right? Like the deer and the buffalo or whatever that I killed in Oregon Trail had nothing to do with what I was learning in the classroom with the teacher. So those experiences have to be connected. So the real thing is just to say online learning, blending itself into our schools with teachers. Students get some sort of control over their learning, and those experiences are connected.
All right. So where are we on that path? Like where do you see things happen? Where are things today when it comes to blended learning?
So blended learning, I think, is exploding way more than the quote-unquote ed reform conversation actually popularly acknowledges. By some estimates, 75% of school districts are doing some form of blended learning across the country right now. And we're seeing really interesting whole school models use blended learning to literally reinvent what they do and what the teaching and learning experience looks like for students and teachers in really positive ways. If we're being honest, a lot of that blended learning is not stuff that we should get excited about also. And if you
talk a little bit about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think actually the original definition that people wanted for blended learning was the best of online learning with the best of brick and mortar schools. And that's great, that's what I hope happens, but if we're being honest, a lot of things that you see out there that could be called nothing except blended learning are not places we would want to send our kids to necessarily. They may be just sort of Night of the Living Dead experiences where students are clicking away at multiple choice questions on a computer. A teacher is there, but they're filing their nails because they feel like they've been replaced. This isn't a good experience. And if we're being honest, there's a fair amount of that going on. And so my sense of where we are in this pathway is blended learning is happening whether we like it or not. The exciting thing about it is the ability to personalize an education for every student's distinct needs so that they can find their passion and realize their potential. But we have to really be pushing people on that quality piece now and educating people about the possibilities that it delivers for the first time in human history for every single child, but we're not there yet.
Okay. So talk about the role of technology in this world. Where were we? What do you see and what's needed, right? So the magic question, where do you see technology's role in this blended learning environment?
Yeah, so I think and maybe it's useful to talk about this as a trajectory, but where I think online learning and technology first started in this environment was really whole class experiences that were delivered online, where you'd write an entire curriculum for a particular course. And students would jump on and have a teacher sort of facilitating and tutoring alongside that experience, but really the course curriculum was all in this packaged content from one vendor. Where I think we've started to evolve to is that teachers and schools are actually using a variety of content and learning experiences from online from a variety of sources to custom configure that learning experience for students. And so you might see a classroom in Los Angeles, California at a school serving kindergarten through 5th grade students where students are rotating through a variety of experiences, one of which is that online learning. Some kids will be working on a program like ST Math, learning math through a visual way of playing a game. Other students will be doing Dreambox learning, very different way, and still other students might be on Khan Academy learning math, depending on their particular point in their learning and what they're trying to work on. And I think the big challenge that we're now facing right now for teachers on the ground is, great, there's all these options, there's a lot of free content out there on the web that I can use and so forth, and connect my students with different learning experiences. And all these things are spitting off data for me that I can figure out where my students are and help them navigate different pathways. Holy cow, how do I get these computer programs, these software programs to really talk to each other in a way that's meaningful so I can do something actionable for students? And I think that's where we are right now, where there haven't really been platforms that have emerged yet that have helped make sense of this very fragmented world that's emerging.
So so you're at Google, right? We have various tools. You know, we have, from an education perspective, we have Google Apps for Education, we have Classroom, we have all these different things. Have you seen?
And happy birthday, Classroom, right?
Right, a couple of days ago, right?
Yeah.
So what has the impact from your perspective, working with those schools? What have you seen? How have you seen our tools being used in education?
I think you're seeing Google's impact all over the place right now in education, and in a couple ways. One, so in some of the environments that are not blended learning by our definition, but you're still starting people experiment with technology, you're seeing Google Apps be used sort of as that entry level, you know, what can we start to do with technology? What can we start to pull in? What can we start to create? And so very clearly disrupting a lot of the software makers that were there before in a lot of these productivity tools, and Google Apps coming in there. What I think then happens once you move to a blended learning environment is you start to say, how can we use time very differently? So we may want students engaging in direct instruction in a particular software program, but now we can start to use Google Apps for the project-based learning, coordinate whole aspects of learning in some pretty exciting ways. And I think you're seeing teachers use those pathways through a variety of Google Apps in pretty neat ways. And I don't know many schools that don't use Google Apps and when they get into blended learning. The other part that I think is really exciting that we talk about a fair amount is the Chromebook world, which from my perspective, Chromebooks make the most sense for the majority of schools getting into this blended learning game. Because they're not just consumption devices, they're also creation devices. And I think that's what separates them from a lot of the tablets that have gotten dumped on the market. And then the price point, I think, is extremely attractive. And then the way you can manage them from the cloud is something that I think schools have found extraordinarily useful in terms of managing devices that otherwise get into problems in other places. One other quick thing, I think your team in particular has done a good job of one other thing, which is not to go into schools and say, all right, here are your Chromebooks, go have fun. You've actually helped people think through, what's the design process that you want to go through? What are you actually trying to solve? And then how can our technology, huge range of it, right, be marshaled to help you solve these problems for teachers and students?
Right.
And from my perspective, that's what every school and district ought to be doing, is a much more grounds up, what are we trying to do together? Right. And then technology in service of that rather than just layer on technology.
Right. So by the way, in a couple minutes, I'm going to ask you guys for questions. So think of your questions, and we want to make sure that we ask Michael some questions. The one question I have for you around blended learning is, where does it usually start? Like, does it start in kindergarten? Does it start in third grade? Where do you see the peak of the blended learning take off?
It's a great question. It's all over the place. And I think for a lot of district schools, it started in high school, particularly in these areas of non-consumption in our language, where the alternative was nothing at all. And I don't think people realize this. 50% of our high schools in this country don't offer calculus. 37% of our high schools do not offer physics. If you're in the state of Georgia, there's 440 high schools roughly. There are 88 certified physics teachers in the entire state, okay? So we can talk about STEM problems or whatever else all we want, like, we gotta get real about that. So high schools literally need to use online learning in their schools to connect students to highly qualified teachers and create very different learning experiences from that which has come before. really important part where a lot of this has started. Right. I think in elementary school, you're seeing it much more in core classes, math and reading. And in terms of what grade level, literally all over the map. I mean, you have great examples all over. I think the one thing you'd say is if you're in kindergarten, I don't want my kid on the screen for 3 hours a day. I'm comfortable with 20, 30 minutes. Right. And if you're in 5th grade, you can do a little bit more than that, right? So it's a continuum. It does not look the same in any one place.
By the way, we both have little tiny babies. Yours are 7, 8 months old.
Yeah.
Mine's 8 months old, about the same time.
Yeah.
Right now, technology is about eating it, right? I posted a picture of my 7-month-old using YouTube for Kids by eating it.
Right? Eating it, yeah. No. So I have twins. So my problems are times 2, I suppose. But, one of them was on the bed the other day and trying to literally crawl. She was crawling over me to get at my phone on the dresser. They have a screen thing, right? And they literally, all she wanted to do was go on a suicide mission off the bed to try to get to this phone. And it was oh my God. So.
It's like a squirrel thing from Up. Right?
Yes, exactly.
They see a screen and whatever they're doing, they squirrel, right?
Yeah.
Right? So you talked about, you didn't even mention computer science and the fact that most states don't even offer
computer
science.
Yeah.
And how do we do computer science?
Huge, and I think that's why you're seeing explosion of companies and tools and nonprofits around coding, whether it's for, and there's been huge campaigns around that, really synergistic way to introduce blended learning into a community.
Right. So a lot of what you're talking about is here based in the U.S. Do you work with school districts across the world? And you mentioned the shortage of classes and teachers who teach specific classes. You think about a country like India, where they're short 1.4 million teachers, right? Or whatever number you want to use, but it's more than 5, right? So how do we, what does blended learning look like on the international scale? What are you seeing in that space?
So I think the models are looking and will look very different from what they look like in the US for a variety of reasons. I think mobile will be a much bigger deal as you go into emerging countries. I also think the disruptive innovations will be much bigger that they create. And the reason I say that is, if you think about disruptive innovation theory, I'm making an assumption everyone has some idea of that here, but it starts in these areas of non-consumption where the alternative is truly nothing at all. In the United States, we have full consumption of schooling, right? Basically everyone has a schooling option. You have non-consumption of classes. In some of these emerging markets and developing countries, you don't have schools, or you don't have schools that are real options in any event. Teachers don't show up, or they're too far for girls and boys to travel. So the opportunity to bring these things in very new solutions into communities themselves, I think is an unbelievable opportunity for innovation, and it has obviously a whole set of barriers, but really interesting work. Well, obviously infrastructure and access is one. I think helping the communities know how to use it is another, and thinking about it not from a US-centric point of view. I think we have a certain attitude that it has to be sort of a tablet or a laptop for it to be quote unquote good enough. In these places, like an SMS program that helps feed the teacher ideas for projects to do with students could be the right learning modality in any given day. I think we have to reset our expectations on that. I spent a fair amount of time in Vietnam looking at this last year. And if you look at the rural areas, there's actually lots of cell phones, but creating relevant curriculum for those contexts, you can't just take our curriculum and port it into a different place and say, there, we've solved it.
Right.
So there's a whole bunch of cultural language and circumstantial, actually making it relevant. I'll give a very concrete example. In the north of Vietnam, there's a lot of tribal communities that are cut off from the rest of the Vietnamese language and culture and so forth. Vietnam basically makes them attend the nationalized schools, if you will, that teach curriculum that's totally irrelevant for their lives and so forth. If they can learn English, though, they can get ahead big time in the tourism worlds and so forth. So basically, all these kids drop out of these government-run schools by the 1st grade, don't attend, tend to live in these very small. They laugh at us if you and I were to walk in because we don't fit in their houses. But super useful if they can get access to English in a way that makes sense for their context and teaches them things that help explain their environment to people like me coming through. people haven't grappled with that.
Right. So I want to turn it over to the audience, but before I do that, as they think about the questions that they want to ask, the question I want to ask is around professional development, right?
Yeah.
What does professional development look like in a blended learning environment? What are we doing right? What are we not doing right?
Well, and let's start with this, which is the role of the teacher dramatically changes in these blended learning environments.
What does that mean?
And so the first thing to say, right, is teachers are absolutely critical still, but they look different, right? They're not delivering a lecture or a lesson plan to a class of 30 students who they are assuming are all in the same place and same learning pathway. That doesn't make any sense because now they're all progressing in different ways, working on different projects. And so a teacher is serving as a tutor, a mentor, a designer of projects, an assessor, evaluator of learning, very different sets of things, maybe even a non-academic coach in many cases dealing with all the emotional and health problems that come up in the way and block people from learning all the time that we don't tend to talk about in this country. So very different role, right? And so if you talk to a blended learning teacher, you say, how much of your teacher preparation program or professional development trained you for what you're doing now? And they'll typically say something like, I don't know, 5% of what I learned trained me for 95% of my job, and 95% of what I learned is maybe relevant for 5% of my job. So that's really difficult that we're putting teachers in these circumstances. The good news, I think, is that teachers are smart people and they, over time, start to figure these things out. The bad news is, like, why do we put them through that and can't we do a better job supporting them? And so my sense is that, A, the preparation programs will have to change dramatically. Tom Arnett on our team is doing a lot of research. He's actually speaking about it at the Ed Elements Summit today on how do we move to new preparation programs. And then I think the professional development should be much more personalized for different teacher needs, just as we would personalize professional development for students, and much more just in time. So rather than some guy like me writes a book, shows up at a school district 3-4 times a year and does professional development that's only tangentially related to what the teachers are doing in the classroom, that they get access to just-in-time professional development every single day with whatever challenges that they're facing that are very tailored to what they're doing. I think Summit Public Schools in the Bay Area probably is the closest to getting this right today with the professional development that they do for teachers in a very personalized way on their platform.
Right. So the last thing, because I have 100 questions for you, but
sure.
You and I have talked about this idea around making sure that none of us are contributing to making old education or bad education faster and more efficient, right?
Yeah.
What do you see happening in that space? What could we all do better in that space?
I'm worried. I think if we hit 50% 2019 and we've replicated the factory model online, we're still delivering, it's what's today, May 7th. Mm-hmm. You were born in the year of the Lamb, therefore we're all doing double-digit addition.
Right.
Like we've really failed. And I think there's a big risk of that. So I think a couple things we have to do. One is really talk about the why of this movement and talk about what it can unleash and make it accessible to. I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice when we show the summits or the high-tech highs because it feels like so out of grasp.
Right.
I think we have to make it a little bit more accessible for the parental and teacher communities around the country. The second thing I think we need to do is think about policy and the environment into which we're making these transformations, and maybe kick it to you for your story about the architecture.
Oh yeah, we were talking before the talk today. The idea that when you look at a building, a beautiful architect in a building, you look at the building and you don't say, I wonder what kind of wrench they used, right? Or what kind of drill they used. You talk about the actual outcome of that building, and so our students are that architect, the outcome. And
I think policy is concerned about the tools, right? Policy mandates the number of minutes you have to sit in seats. It actually literally funds schools based on the number of minutes students are in seats. So if you step back from it for a moment, you say, like, we've been measuring the wrong end of the student for 100 years, but we continue to do so. Restrictions around, class size, even what classes look like, a lot of the facility restrictions. We could imagine a much different education system. A lot of the teacher eval policies coming on right now are counterproductive. They're very consumed with inputs. We need to be looking at not just student outcomes at a point in time on a test, but actually the growth of students over time and at an individual level. I think the other thing that we do unfairly right now is, and I'm a big believer in the accountability, the intentions behind the accountability movement and the power of standards if we do it right. But right now, if students are in 5th grade and they come in at a 2nd grade reading level, we test them at the end of the year with the 5th grade test and say they're now reading at a 4th grade level. Teacher doesn't get any credit for that. We don't see that. That's ridiculous. Like, that teacher just made 2 years of progress with that student. That's amazing.
Right.
We don't focus on that. We don't talk about that.
Right.
And so we need to do a much better job of thinking about what does assessment mean? What are the rich kinds of assessments we actually want to see?
Right.
And how do we evaluate those in a fair and equitable way?
Okay, I got a mic up here. I want to turn it over to whoever has questions. Of course, you guys have questions. We'll start up here in the front row. And as they're asking questions, the last question I'm going to ask you is, what can we, Google, do? Right? And so just think about that question. And I'll ask you before we wrap up.
Cool.
So I work on a product here at Google, Course Builder, and one of the things that we worry about is content delivery to the other 5 billion. Right, and that mostly looks like small devices, right? Cell phones or maybe tablets. How do you do content delivery on a small device effectively?
Yeah, and this goes to the conversation we were having about not applying, I think, the US standards of what we think good content has to be, is I think we have to take a very different mindset and understand how they're getting content today or not getting content, and then what is a good enough state, right? And then what sets it on a trajectory that starts to improve. And I think that's tough sometimes when we're talking about improving social sectors, is like something that's not perfect but good enough. But that's the coin in the realm with disruption, which is like when the Google search engine started, it doesn't do all that it did now, but it was good enough, right? It was good enough to get it started and change the way we view information and content. And so I think getting a good enough perspective is the first thing. The second thing, I think, this is probably somewhat controversial, but I think Silicon Valley is way too bullish right now on video. Video is useful in certain learning circumstances, but it's actually, for many tasks, a very inefficient way of learning. Ironic as I'm being videoed. But and I think we need to think about what are short chunks of information that cause people to interact a lot in these modalities, right? That actually create lots of opportunities for interaction to build motivation, and you actually learn through your interaction and the explanation afterwards, not necessarily the content that was delivered at you, because that makes you a much more active learner. Yeah, video push, like where we create, exactly, where we think that like 10-minute video is the best way to consume and understand content. I actually think the learning sciences disagree strongly with that. And there are certain contexts where video is extraordinarily useful at illuminating a certain thing that can only be understood through video or being transported there. But actually short text-based things that cause you to respond and talk about things and be an active learner, which are well suited to some of these small devices, I think can actually be a much more powerful medium in many cases.
Right, and you and I have often talked about this, and you mentioned at the beginning of the answer, good enough, right?
Yes.
I think the biggest problem in education, from my perspective, is this idea that there's some magic model out there that you have to find, right? And that you just have to do that. And, the title of my keynote is Iteration and Innovation. Like, how do we create a culture of iteration and innovation that there is no school, right? It's a constant change.
It's a constant change.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the big conclusion in our book, so Blended is basically a design guide for educators.
By the way, this is a how-to book, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a field guide.
Right.
But it doesn't say this is the answer.
Right.
Right? It actually gives a process for you to create a constantly iterating, improving innovation. Mm-hmm. And I think the real message is like, you know what? Even if you nailed it for today's circumstance, in 10 years from now, society's going to have changed some more, and like we need to keep evolving and innovating with that. So how do you do that? Right. I think we need to stop thinking of school as like a finished product that, okay, that's it, let's all do that.
Right, exactly.
Hi. So you mentioned that we need a platform to emerge to kind of pull some of the student data together in order for blended learning to really take off.
Yeah.
How do you balance that with what feels like a tightening in student data privacy laws?
Great question. And the $1 million one that Julia Freeland on my team is starting to think about, but I haven't done enough thought on. I think that we do need to create a different narrative around why data matters in education, because it's been a very defensive conversation at this point, right? We've just been talking about, oh, of course, data shouldn't be used to sell products to kids and stuff like that, rather than making the case for like why you as a parent, you actually want your teacher and student having access to data, and not just like their data, right? Because it's an incredibly empowering thing when you as a student, let's talk about that for a moment, can say like, I didn't get that right, and I can do something about it to improve myself, right? That's a deeply motivating thing. We haven't done a good job of articulating that in a way that actually is a positive case that it makes sense and people can rally around. So I think actually the biggest thing is play some offense on this issue and start to show scenarios about why parents and teachers would want this and what it can do for learning, as opposed to, well, yeah, of course we don't mean that, and a sort of defensive crouch where we've been.
And the irony is that we accept, the parents accept, and I'm a parent, but I accept the data, or we accept the data that's the assessment-based data that's 6 months old or a year old.
Yeah, literally.
But we're not looking at the performance-based data, which is the critical stuff, right?
Well,
the stuff that we really need.
And I think, right, this whole opt-out world right now that's happening, we need to be carving a consensus of assessment can be a much more seamless, light touch thing that is happening constantly in the background in even objective ways. And yeah, it can be a lighter footprint that is truly individually focused and helping inform and gives us an accountability picture, transparency, but is really about the learning itself. And people can get behind that. The assessments aren't there today for that. But helping parents understand we're on a road to that, and not to neglect kids in low-income circumstances, who might not have the same sort of advantages, and why we're on that, why we're on a journey. But I also think it would help to articulate it as a journey and not say that the assessments we have today we should be happy about.
Right, exactly.
I just want to add to that, because this is actually what I've been looking for.
Yeah.
And people always think the Department of Ed has tons of money. We don't. And I think Google may be in a place to really be able to help with this, because I've been talking to a number of people about trying to figure out some kind of short infographic or something that actually leads parents to, like, really clearly articulating this is good use of data. It's almost like the old video of how a bill becomes. It's like I was only a bill.
Mr.
But,
Bill.
you go through and it's sort of, you literally, where the data goes. Like, this is a good place. This is an okay place. You can protect this data even though you're using the data to make the back end look.
Yeah.
And I really do think some clear definitions and literally some visualization of what that looks like would help the whole conversation work a little bit better.
Right. But I also, to Michael's point about creating some language around what we're doing, we do it in sports, right? We have performance-based data in sports. Right? Baseball player comes up to bat, he bats 276 on Thursdays. When it's raining, he bats 234. Right? We have that level of performance data. He doesn't take a test at the end of the season to find out how much he knows about baseball. Right? So it's a different philosophy. We need to get better on the performance.
We need to give it better scenarios to help people shoot for that also, in terms of the developer community.
Right.
Or people who are building off the Google platforms that you all have. I mean, inspiring, I think, is what we need to do. I agree with what you said, and I think just the quick add-on, right, is, and I'm blanking on what I was going to say now, but just helping districts when they're adopt in a responsible way would also be really useful. And I think if a place like Google could rally some of the other hardware makers to this game and others, sort of like a pledge of we will have this sort of behavior as we come in.
We signed a pledge.
You have, yeah. But I mean, literally making that known among districts of I won't work with you, Mr. PC, unless I know you've committed to this. And maybe not just around data, quite frankly, but I won't sell you one-to-one laptops unless I've seen some sort of design that you've gone through about why you would use them.
Now you're pushing your luck. All right.
I am, but you're the only game that I can push it.
Right.
I have two questions. I'm going to make them sound like one so Jamie doesn't yell at me. So
No, you can ask two questions. That's fine. You're Tracy. You can...
exciting. Okay, so but they're really they're both around sort of philosophy of the future of education.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally, I think we all who work on education feel strongly about personalized learning. Clearly, that's a huge place where technology can be an enabler. It's very exciting. It makes a ton of sense. We also talk a lot about project-based learning as a way that kids will interact more with what they're being presented with.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on two things. I'd love your thoughts on like best practices around personalized learning. What do you think of things like alt school? Some of the folks who are trying to solve that problem from a technology perspective, and then. Do you feel like a focus on project-based learning is warranted, or is there some other future that you imagine that's sort of around the curve that maybe we're not seeing that's the next big thing, or or is there more a generalized way to think about it?
So I'm really glad, first of all, that you separated those two terms, because I think a lot of people, they hear student-centered or personalized and automatically say that's 100% project-based, and I don't think that's actually true, right? You don't learn to shoot free throws in basketball in the game. You actually have to practice them, and it's not always the most exciting. But you also have to play the game to understand the context and build motivation and apply, right? So there are give and takes, I think, in education, and we've had this unbelievably broken dialogue between isms of you're either core knowledge versus project-based learning, right? And it's like, well, hold on. I think there's actually value in both, and what's the right mix of things. And it turns out you do need knowledge to know what to Google in learning, and so that still is important, but so it too is applying it. So the way I think about blended learning is it offers us the opportunity to change the use of time so that we can break these things that have seemed like that have been false dichotomies, but I think has been very difficult, like in the time-based way we've used schools, to actually do both. There's some great project-based learning schools that are out there, but there's some really bad ones where kids are doing superficial things and they don't really understand fundamentals underneath it, right? And so this is really the opportunity, I think, to split that. So I'll answer the question more directly now with just that preface, because if you look at Summit Public Schools, they're one that I think is getting the mix right. On personalized learning, really excited about a number of the potentials coming around. I think there's a bit of a split in the field right now around adaptive learning engines versus a more playlist approach to the world. It's not clear to me what is going to win there. I actually think there's value in both. Mm-hmm. And I think the adaptive learning is a way more complex problem than most people believe it is. Because yes, you're getting way more data from students, but they're also sending a lot of signals based on what they ate that morning that is very difficult to account for. So I think super interesting place, really interested in what Newton is doing, really interested in what alt school is doing, really interested in what Khan Academy is doing in that world as well. So lots of interesting experiments, really interested also simultaneously on the playlist approach, like Summit Public Schools is doing with their personalized learning plan, where there's 10 different ways to learn a given standard, and actually students get to navigate and make those choices. And again, I think adaptability versus assignability or choice will end up being a false dichotomy in the future as well. I think there will be a mix where, just like Google helps nudge me, it doesn't actually make decisions for me as I'm doing things. And I think there'll be something, a trade-off. And younger students, you may give more help making those decisions and do gradual release as they get older so that they become lifelong learners and really owners of that learning experience. In terms of alt school specifically, for those that don't know, just raised $100 million. I went to college with Max, so know him reasonably well. I am really interested to see what actually comes out of it. I think at minimum, it'll be a really exciting school network itself that helps to disrupt a lot of independent or private schools around the country. I think this micro school network is very exciting that's emerging. I think we might in the future sort of see the Airbnb of schooling that allows for pop-ups and allows for very different communities to form, and depending on the day or what subject you're learning in the future. I'm skeptical of taking a platform developed very deeply in a particular school setting with a very particular model and then just thinking, oh, we'll just give that to a district and it will work and it will save them 30% because they don't need this administrative overhead or something like that. I'm very skeptical of that because it's interdependent. And I think that's important right now. We're not ready for a modular stage, but I don't think it'll just port over. Right. Project-based learning, I think it's a deeper understanding of what projects can be and how they interact with knowledge and things like that will come down the pipeline, if that makes sense. And I also think if we can start to actually tie them into real world problems increasingly, that's maybe the next frontier where we start to bring employers and experts and social capital into these communities in very different ways from the ways we've done traditionally. I think Google can be a big part of that.
I wonder if it's almost better to think about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation as what you're trying to create out of that system,
yes,
as opposed to actually having it be project-based.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it creates an excitement and a desire to know more, right? And also, I didn't know what engineering was until I was a junior in college, right? So a much better sense of what real jobs and careers are out there. So.
But it's also, we started the conversation by trying to find blended learning. We can do the same thing with personal learning, whether it's personal, personalized, individualized, right? Or project-based learning. And what project-based learning is, I often get pushback from students. I was speaking at ASU with Dr. Crow at a class, and one of the students says, I don't want to do project-based learning because when I did project-based learning when I was in school, I was the one who did all the work, right? And I'm like, you didn't do project-based. You did one paper that was split up by 5 people that could have been done by one person. That's not project-based learning. So a lot of it has to do with the definitions that we use.
I agree with that.
Right?
I agree with that.
Yeah. Oh, we got lots of questions. I want to make sure I get them all in.
Can you talk a little bit about, as we think about the achievement gap, right, the role of technology in helping to close it, or potentially, the risk that it actually could worsen it?
Yeah.
Because we talked about the ability to improve education outcomes overall, but with the worst schools.
Totally good question. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that higher income kids are already going to get access to these tools, and so it's incumbent upon schools to do these things for low income, because otherwise that achievement gap will really widen. I think the other thing personalized learning does is a lot of students fall further and further behind because lessons continue to move, and you actually have a deep fundamental misconception or misunderstanding much earlier. And if you can actually change that, so go back in their learning, if you will, and change that, it actually unlocks a much faster trajectory than we give credit to low-income students typically for being able to do, which you can give that any set of names, but I think of it as education malpractice often. And so I think the small evidence we have actually is that unleashing this actually causes these people we thought of as slow learners or low on the achievement gap or whatever to actually soar much faster than we thought was possible. I do think it will create gaps because it will allow the high flyers to go much further and faster. I think the hope is that income is not the predictor of those gaps and that it's based on other factors.
Right, and the numbers haven't changed, right? So if you make more than $75,000 a year, there's a 95% chance you have internet access at home and the technology at home. If you make less than $30,000, it's like 45%, whatever that number is.
You would know it better, yeah.
So you know that that gap's already there, and it's possible to make that worse.
And
Rich school districts have technology, poor school districts don't. That's just a fact.
And we also know that how students in those areas today use those technologies is not actually often positive because they don't have a community, teachers, parents around them helping guide them in a productive way on that journey. So there's plenty of studies that just show the introduction of technology doesn't do anything, right? So it's really, we have to be very deliberate about designing coherent models for the circumstances, I think.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about over-reliance on video, which kind of made me think, do you think overall in the blended learning space that we're not leveraging enough of what we know about behavioral and educational psychology? Are there any examples of programs you think are doing that particularly well, or are there gaps in the research that you think we're not drawing upon enough?
Yes, we are totally ignoring that field. The developers, like if you haven't heard of Richard Meyer and his work on e-learning and the science of instruction, like you are just starting behind, right? The 8 ball. Not to say that there won't be exceptions to that research. I think a lot of education research is pretty deeply flawed because it looks at the average as opposed to the anomalies and comes up with a circumstance-based theory. But there is a lot of good research that can boost you up dramatically to start with and then explore anomalies from there. And I think most people are totally ignoring what we know. There are a few good providers out there based on different facets of it. I mean, I think ST Math does it pretty well. But there's a huge gap in that right now.
And not just that, we have 40 years of research and evidence about like what really good learning can look like. And I think technology can help us actually implement a lot of that. We just been ignoring it. Or the positive way of saying it is that technology hasn't been ready to use to implement. I'm the glass half full guy. He's the empty glass.
Yeah. Just there.
Back to your question about data and sharing that daily. How can you avoid the stress that can cause in a family, especially like at a high school level, when you're seeing daily grade reports and daily progress reports, and the stress of the parents coming down on the students for that? And in some ways, it seems like there's too much information that is not being dealt with between student and teacher before it's dealt with between student and family.
Yeah. So I'm not sure the connection to parents that should be made there. I think that's probably another design choice. That should be made within the schools. I more meant in terms of what it can do for teachers to more effectively work with students and students to be more effectively motivated. One thing we also know from the research that people ignore is that data is not necessarily a motivating force in learning. So let me explain, right? If you give a student data and they have no ability to do anything with that data, it just says you got a 70%. That is deeply demotivating to learning. If it says, you haven't mastered this, and this is the particular area, now go back and work again, so what we call a competency-based or mastery-based learning system, then data is deeply motivating because you can do something with it. And so that's the type of data and the type of system that we actually need to use it in to empower learners to understand where they are going in their learning and so that they can constantly be using it to improve with their teachers. How that works with parents, I think that's a community by community decision that makes sense, but it also changes, like, it's sort of like, think of it as A, B, or try again, right? Like we're gonna eliminate letter grades as we know it if we really get this right. Because you really ought to be mastering something before you move on. Sal Khan gives the great analogy, like you wouldn't be like, we're building a house. I got 80% of it, right? So let's move on to the second floor now. But that's how we do it in schools, and those gaps create huge problems later in learning. So, hopefully that's helpful.
Or you don't even need a house. You can, in our own work world, right? If someone on the team hands one of us like the strategy, and we're like, oh, this is about a C+. Thanks.
Yeah.
Next assignment, right? No, you iterate and you change it. Yeah.
So I think in education over the last, 50, 60 years, the publishers have really been the big players.
Yeah.
And as they're grappling with this move, I think you see the pitfall oftentimes of a textbook just being digitized.
Yes.
So I'm curious, if you were to jump in as the CEO of a Pearson or an HMH or McGraw-Hill, where would you take that digital content strategy as a whole?
Oh God.
Why couldn't you ask that like an hour ago?
Talk about jobs I wouldn't want. Okay, so I think the lessons of disruption are clear. When you want to be the one to disrupt yourself, you can't do it within your current organization. You have to set up an autonomous organization that has the freedom to rethink everything and can ask the parent for things, but cannot be commanded to do things by the parent. And so if I were them, I would set up truly autonomous business models that could say, yes, we want to draw upon your rich resources, but we're not going to be told how we're going to use them or deploy them, and we are going to have very different processes and priorities inside to do this. And that's how I would approach it. I also think our policymakers would do us a great service if they stopped talking about digital textbooks, because that's not what we're trying to do here.
Right. So speaking of digital textbooks, I want you to think about the question I was going to ask you. I also want to plug your book. If you are like my kid who cannot read a digital book.
Yeah.
He actually likes the hardcover books. There's hardcover books back there, or there you can get it on Amazon and Google Play and other places as well. So last question for you before you wrap up. What can we do to help?
Yeah, so I think Google can do a number of things. I think one, the continued improvement of the Chromebook platform at a price that schools can embrace. Huge, because it takes the equipment question off the table and hopefully shifts the question to the learning question. I think the fact that, and I've always felt that with you, is that you ask the learning question first is the other really big thing. And I know you said the pledge won't happen, but I think the more we can get a conversation around the learning questions we're trying to solve first, really important. And then a lot of the apps and the suite of tools that you can bring to bear, regardless of platform, quite frankly, right? But showing, again, those things in service of the learning goals, just tremendous, but really make it about the learning in each and every case. The other thing I'd love to see Google do is think about, you guys have thought a lot about the learning registry and tagging open education resources and things like that. I'd love to see more thought about how assessments play into that, because that's what will truly make learning content be useful and come to life in a much more rich way. And I don't think we're seeing enough innovation in that space.
Right. Okay. Well, help me thank Michael for showing up today. Thank you very much. Thank you guys for coming. All right.